It doesn't smell like war, not at first. The sailor standing at the prow of that Umayyad warship in the spring of 718 AD probably smelled salt air, the pitch of his own hull, the sweat of 300 men packed into a vessel built for speed and conquest. He was part of the greatest armada the Arab world had ever sent to sea. He had crossed the Mediterranean. He had survived the cold. He was close, so close to glory. And then, from the darkness, something impossible happened. A sound tore across the water, not the crack of timber, not the screaming of orders, something deeper, more mechanical, a low, pressurized hiss, like the breath of a creature that had no business existing. And then the light. God, the light. A jet of liquid, thick and orange, launched from the bronze tube mounted on the prow of a Roman droman ship, cutting through the black water toward him. It didn't arc gracefully like a burning arrow. It moved like something alive, like a river of molten hatred, and when it hit the hull of the ship next to him, it didn't just ignite, it consumed. The wood didn't char, it melted. The fire grabbed the planks and the pitch and the rigging all at once, and it refused, absolutely refused, to be put out. Men threw seawater on it. The fire spread across the surface of the sea itself, burning on top of the water, impossible to drown. Men jumped overboard and found themselves burning in the ocean. The screaming... There are no surviving words that can adequately describe what that screaming sounded like across an open harbour in the dead of a spring night. Byzantine chroniclers would later describe the weapon in simpler, colder terms. Fire projected from siphons, Arab ships set alight, vessels burning until they were gone. Not ordinary flame, not a weapon sailors knew how to fight. You have to stop for a second and actually sit with that image. This wasn't fire as ancient people knew it. This was something categorically different, a chemistry so ahead of its time that even now, 13 centuries later, historians and chemists still cannot agree on exactly what was in that mixture. The Romans called it their secret. They died with it as their secret. And on these spring waters of 718 AD, in the churning Bosphorus, that secret became one of the most decisive weapons in the history of medieval warfare. But to understand why that fire mattered, why it didn't just destroy an armada but arguably saved an entire civilization, you have to go back. Back to the year before, when the situation for the Roman Empire was so catastrophic, so utterly hopeless, that even the emperor himself must have wondered if his city had finally run out of time. By the early 700s AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, what historians call Byzantium, though the people themselves simply called it Rome, was a ghost of its former self. It still stood, it still functioned. But the previous century had been a systematic dismemberment. The Arab forces of the Rashidun and then Umayyad Caliphates had torn away Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and the Levant in astonishing succession. Those weren't peripheral territories. Egypt alone had fed the empire for centuries. Syria had been its eastern buffer. The loss of those provinces didn't just shrink the Roman map. It gutted the empire's economic engine, its grain supply, and its defensive depth all at once. And the hits kept coming. Arab raiding fleets began appearing off the Aegean coast. Towns that had been Roman for 700 years were sacked, burned, left empty. The empire's internal politics descended into a vicious cycle of military coups and counter-coups throughout the late 7th and early 8th centuries. Between 695 and 717 AD alone, no fewer than 6 emperors sat on the throne in Constantinople, most of them deposed violently, several blinded or killed. For any empire, that kind of chaos is corrosive. For an empire fighting for its physical survival, it was potentially fatal. This was the world that the Umayyad Caliphate was watching from Damascus, and they saw opportunity. The Umayyad dynasty at the peak of its power in the early 700s AD was not just a regional force. It was arguably the most powerful political and military entity on the planet at that moment. From its capital in Damascus, the Caliphate stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west, where Arab and Berber armies had recently crossed into Spain and were pushing north toward the Pyrenees, all the way east through Persia to the borders of India. This was an empire of staggering ambition, staggering resources, and a theological self-confidence that viewed the continued existence of Christian Constantinople as not merely a political problem, but a religious affront. Because here is the thing that modern viewers sometimes forget. For the Umayyad leadership, Constantinople wasn't just a city to be captured for its wealth or its strategic position, though it had both in abundance. The Prophet Muhammad himself, according to tradition preserved in Islamic literature, had reportedly spoken of Constantinople's conquest as a destiny. The city was identified in Arab strategic thinking with the idea of completing the Islamic world's rightful expansion. Taking it would be proof of divine favour. Failing to take it, repeatedly, was becoming an embarrassment that the caliphs could not afford to let stand. Caliph Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik, who ordered the 717 campaign, was a man who understood this perfectly. He had spent years preparing for this assault. Agents reported that thousands of cedar and cypress trees from Lebanon were being felled and hauled to Arab shipyards. The scale of the naval construction project was something the ancient world had not seen since the Great Punic Wars of the Roman Republic. The intelligence leaked to the Byzantines. Spies operated in both directions, and even knowing what was coming didn't make it any less terrifying to hear the final numbers. 1,800 ships. Let that sit for a moment. 1,800 vessels of war and transport, ranging from heavy warships to supply galleys packed with grain, siege equipment, horses, and soldiers. Some ancient sources offer even higher figures, up to 2,500 ships in total when auxiliary craft are included, though modern historians generally accept the figure of around 1,800 combat-relevant vessels. The fleet was assembled in the ports of Syria and Egypt, and began its movement toward the Aegean in the summer of 717 AD. The land army was equally staggering. At its core, the force that Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, the caliph's half-brother, one of the most accomplished Arab generals of the age, led across Anatolia has been estimated at 80,000 to 120,000 men. These were not raw conscripts. The Umayyad army was a veteran fighting force, hardened by decades of conquest across 3 continents. It included elite Arab cavalry, disciplined Syrian infantry, and auxiliary troops drawn from the full breadth of the Caliphate. They moved through Anatolia largely unopposed because there was nothing in the field that could stop them. Personally, when I read the Byzantine Chronicle of Theophanes the Confessor, who's really our primary window into this whole siege, and he describes this army moving toward Constantinople, I get a kind of vertigo. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was a campaign designed to end the city as a Roman capital. The Romans watching from the walls of Constantinople as Maslama's forces crossed from Asia into Europe over the Dardanelles in early summer 717 AD were watching a military mobilization on a scale their home had almost never faced. Understanding who Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik was matters enormously here, because he wasn't just some general handed an army and told to go win. He was a prince of the Umayyad dynasty, a veteran commander who had spent the better part of 2 decades fighting along the Byzantine frontier. He knew the terrain. He had taken fortified cities before. He was methodical, patient, and deeply experienced in the kind of logistical endurance that a prolonged siege required. More importantly, he had a plan. The plan was deceptively simple in outline, devastating in its potential. The land army would sweep around the western landward side of Constantinople and establish siege lines across the Theodosian Walls, the famous triple-layered defensive barrier built in the 5th century by Emperor Theodosius II. These walls had repelled every attacker for nearly 3 centuries, and Maslama had no illusions about storming them in a frontal assault. He didn't need to. The fleet would simultaneously blockade the sea lanes into the city, the Golden Horn to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, cutting off Constantinople from any possibility of resupply. Without grain coming in by sea, the most fortified city on earth would simply starve. It was a rational, logical, strategically sound plan. Given the resources Maslama commanded, it should have worked. There was one variable the plan did not adequately account for, a soldier from the Anatolian borderlands named Leo who had just become emperor. Leo III came from Germanicea, a frontier town in what is now southern Turkey. He was not a man of the palace. He was a man of the borderlands, a military commander who had spent his adult life watching the Umayyad tide advance, who understood the Arab way of war from direct, hard experience. He had risen through the ranks through competence and ruthlessness, and in March 717 AD, just months before Maslama's army arrived, he had seized the imperial throne from the previous emperor Theodosius III in a coup that was, even by the anarchic standards of 8th century Byzantine politics, remarkably swift. Theophanes tells us that Leo was already preparing for the siege before he was even formally crowned. This is the detail that separates Leo from most of the generals and emperors who came before him in those dark years. He did not wait for the crisis to arrive. He ordered the citizens of Constantinople to stockpile 3 years' worth of supplies inside the city. He sent emissaries north to the Bulgars, traditional enemies of both Rome and the Arab world, to negotiate an alliance. He oversaw the reinforcement of the sea walls. He personally ensured that the Byzantine navy, with its terrible secret weapon, was fully armed, crewed, and positioned inside the Golden Horn where the Arab fleet could not yet see it. Honestly, you have to marvel at the man's nerve. He had been emperor for roughly 5 months when Maslama's army began building its siege lines outside his walls. 5 months to prepare against the largest invasion force his civilization had ever faced. And he was ready. Constantinople in 717 AD was not just the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the largest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its markets traded in silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, or at least they had before the Arab conquest had systematically severed those routes. The Theodosian Walls that protected the city's landward western approach were an engineering marvel. An outer wall, a main inner wall reaching nearly 12 metres high and 5 metres thick, and a deep protective moat. A defensive system stretching more than 6 kilometres from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. No army had broken them. Not the Avars, not the Persians, not the first Arab siege 40 years earlier. And the citizens of Constantinople knew this, but knowing that your walls had held before and knowing that they would hold now against this, against 1,800 ships and potentially 100,000 men, are very different things psychologically. The chronicles and hagiographical literature of the period speak of genuine terror in the city, as Maslama's forces arrived and began constructing their siege works in the late summer of 717 AD. Religious processions were held. Icons were paraded along the walls. The Patriarch of Constantinople is recorded as presiding over prayer vigils that stretched through entire nights. These were not people who were calm. These were people who were terrified and praying and hoping desperately that their walls and their emperor and whatever god remained on their side would be enough. On September 3rd, 717 AD, Maslama made his first significant naval move. He ordered his fleet to reposition northward through the Hellespont toward the Golden Horn, aiming to complete the sea blockade and strangle the city's remaining maritime supply lines from the Black Sea. It was the logical next step. It was also a fatal mistake. Not because the plan was wrong, but because Maslama's sailors were not ready for what waited for them. The Arab fleet, as medieval historian Andrew Latham and military historian Randley Brown II note in their analysis, was crewed in large part by inexperienced sailors. These were men who had been recruited, trained and pressed into service for a grand strategic campaign, but the open sea and the narrow, treacherous currents of the Hellespont and the Golden Horn entrance are two entirely different beasts. As the Arab ships repositioned northward, they lost the wind. The formation broke apart. The fleet slowed into a confused, disorganized mass right at the entrance to the Golden Horn, directly in front of the hidden Byzantine fleet. Leo was watching, and Leo moved. The gates of the Golden Horn opened, and the Byzantine dromons, those sleek, low, fast Roman war galleys, the technological heirs of a naval tradition stretching back to antiquity, surged out into the channel, mounted on their prows, bronze siphon devices, pressurized, loaded, ready. The Arab sailors had no warning, no time to maneuver, no framework for understanding what was coming at them. 20 Arab ships were destroyed in minutes, burned to the waterline, their crews gone. The survivors turned south and ran, abandoning any attempt to complete the blockade for the time being. In a single action, Leo had shattered the naval component of Maslama's strategy. The sea lanes to Constantinople, particularly the Black Sea routes bringing grain from Crimea, remained open. The city would not starve. The Arabs were back to a land siege alone, pressed against walls they couldn't break, with a winter coming that nobody on either side had yet begun to fully dread. But the siege was only beginning. Maslama's army was not broken. It was vast, determined and commanded by one of the Arab world's finest generals. The land fortifications were going up around the city. More ships were coming. The Arab world's full military weight still pressed against Constantinople's stone skin. The fire on the water had been only a preview. The Arab army that spread itself across the Thracian plain west of Constantinople in the late summer of 717 AD was, by any historical standard, an awe-inspiring thing to behold. The siege lines extended from the Sea of Marmara in the south all the way north to the Golden Horn, a fortified trench and earthwork barrier that effectively mirrored the Theodosian Walls in a kind of terrible symmetry. Maslama knew he could not storm those walls with infantry. No one could. The stone was too thick, the towers too high, the defenders too stubborn and too dug in. His strategy was patience. He had the numbers to sustain a blockade indefinitely, and once the city's food ran out, Constantinople would fall into his hands like ripe fruit. At least, that was the plan. What Maslama had not fully prepared for was the particular cruelty of a Thracian winter, pressing down on an army that was designed to fight in the arid heat of the Arab world. The summer faded fast. September's warmth gave way to an October that felt wrong, somehow colder and wetter than the season warranted. The army was enormous, but enormous armies consume enormous quantities of food, fodder, and fuel. The Arab supply chain depended overwhelmingly on the fleet maintaining sea lanes, open enough to bring provisions from the Arab-controlled ports of the eastern Mediterranean. But Leo's surprise naval strike on September 3rd had completely unravelled that plan. The Byzantine fleet now effectively held the Bosphorus. Arab supply ships couldn't get through without running directly into bronze-siphoned dromons loaded with Greek fire. And after watching 20 warships burn to the waterline in minutes, Arab captains were not eager to test that gamble twice. The Arab land army, a force of perhaps 80,000 to 120,000 men, was now cut off from reliable resupply by sea, sitting in foreign territory, with winter coming. Leo, watching from behind his walls, did not attack. This is the part of the man's strategic genius that tends to get underappreciated in the broader telling of the story. A lesser commander might have been tempted, flush with the initial naval success, to open the gates and drive the Arabs back in a dramatic sortie. Leo did no such thing. He understood that behind those walls his men were warm and fed. Out on that plain, Maslama's army was beginning to suffer. The mathematics of attrition were working for the defence without a single additional Roman soldier needing to die. Patience was the weapon, the walls were the weapon, and the oncoming cold was doing damage that no Roman sword needed to inflict. By November 717 AD, Theophanes the Confessor, writing in the early 9th century but drawing on sources very close to the events, records that the Arab forces had already begun slaughtering their pack animals for food. This is a detail that sounds almost mundane until you think through its implications. Pack animals aren't just food. They are transportation, siege equipment movers, cavalry remounts. Every horse and camel eaten for survival was a logistical capability permanently removed from the Arab order of battle. The army was consuming itself, and the winter had barely started. What followed through the winter months of 717 into 718 AD was a slow, grinding catastrophe that the Arab chronicles struggle to describe, and the Byzantine sources recorded with a kind of grim satisfaction. The cold in Thrace that year was abnormally severe. Theophanes records that snow fell across the region for nearly 100 days, a figure that, even allowing for hagiographical exaggeration, speaks to a winter of punishing and unusual intensity. Soldiers who had marched from Syria and Egypt and the warm plains of Anatolia had no physical or psychological preparation for this. The Arab army had no adequate winter clothing, inadequate shelter, and dwindling fuel. Frostbite began to claim fingers and toes. Disease, the inevitable companion of any large cold malnourished army, moved through the camp, and then things got darker still. Theophanes does not flinch from the detail, and neither should we. When the horses were gone and the camels were gone, when the stored grain ran to nothing, the Arab soldiers began eating whatever organic matter they could find. The chronicles record that men were reduced to consuming plant sprouts pulled from frozen ground, animal dung, and eventually, and this is the part that the Arab sources themselves apparently refused to record, in full, the flesh of their own dead comrades. This is not a rhetorical flourish. Theophanes states it directly. An army of tens of thousands of men, committed to a religious war, found itself committing acts that violated everything their faith stood for, simply to stay alive another week on a frozen European plain. Honestly, when I read those passages in Theophanes, It stops me cold every single time. Because these were human beings, men with families, men who had marched north convinced they were doing God's work, that the prophet's prophecy about Constantinople was finally being fulfilled through their bodies and their swords, and instead they were dying of cold and starvation in the mud outside the most impregnable set of walls on earth. History is merciless that way. It doesn't care about your theology or your ambitions. It cares about logistics, weather, and whether you made the right call on September 3rd when the wind died. Inside the city, the situation was not paradise by any measure. The population of Constantinople had been rationing since before the siege began. Leo's orders about 3-year supply stockpiles had given the city a critical buffer. But rationing is still rationing, and prolonged siege conditions wear on the human psyche in ways that no amount of fortified walls can prevent. Theophanes records continued religious processions, prayers for deliverance, the display of holy icons along the walls, the blachane icon of the Virgin Mary, Constantinople's sacred protector, held aloft by crowds pleading for divine intervention. The city was holding. But it was holding through gritted teeth and faith that its emperor knew what he was doing, and Leo did. While Maslama's army froze and starved, Leo was in communication with the Bulgar Khan Tervel to the north. The Bulgars were a nomadic warrior people whose relationship with Constantinople was complicated. They had fought the empire as often as they had allied with it, but Leo's diplomatic skill was considerable, and the Khan saw a clear opportunity. An Arab empire stretching to the Balkans was as much a threat to Bulgar sovereignty as it was to Roman. Tervel agreed to bring his warriors south to strike the Arab rear, and this commitment, quietly secured over the winter months, represented perhaps the single most important diplomatic achievement of Leo's reign. The Bulgars would not arrive for months, but they were coming. Meanwhile, Maslama was not sitting passively waiting to starve. He made attempts to alleviate the situation. Foraging parties were sent out into the Thracian countryside, but the surrounding territory had been largely stripped by the time they reached it, and Byzantine cavalry harassed these parties relentlessly. Maslama sent word back to Damascus requesting relief, both a fresh supply fleet and reinforcements. Word came back that 2 large relief fleets had been assembled and were en route from the ports of Egypt and Africa. The first relief fleet sailed into Aegean waters in the spring of 718 AD, carrying desperately needed grain, equipment, and additional troops. This was the moment Maslama had been waiting for through that catastrophic winter. If the fleet could break through to the city and re-establish supply lines, the siege could be renewed in earnest. A fed, resupplied army behind fortified siege lines was a completely different proposition than a starving, plague-ridden one. And this fleet was large. Sources suggest approximately 400 ships for the first relief squadron, followed by a second Egyptian squadron of around 360 vessels. Thousands of fresh sailors and soldiers crossing the Aegean, loaded with provisions and weapons aimed directly at Constantinople. Maslama's gamble had been to hold long enough. Now, he thought, the tide was turning. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know because the Byzantines guarded this information as one of the most precious state secrets in the empire's history, was what was waiting for those ships in the waters of the Bosphorus. Leo had been preparing. The bronze siphon tubes on the Roman dromons had been maintained, loaded, and kept in readiness since September. The crews were drilled, the weapon was primed, and as the first relief fleet entered the narrow, dangerous waters between Europe and Asia, with the spring of 718 AD opening the seas again, Leo III gave the order to move. The relief fleet's captains, crucially, were manned in large part by Egyptian, Christian conscripts, sailors who had been pressed into Umayyad service and had no particular loyalty to the Arab cause. Theophanes records a remarkable detail here. When the Egyptian fleet saw the Byzantine dromons approaching and caught their first sight of the Greek fire apparatus being made ready, many of those conscript sailors simply deserted. They jumped ship, swam for the European shore, and surrendered to the Byzantines. It was a spontaneous collective act of defiance that speaks volumes about the morale of the Arab allied forces by the spring of 718 AD. The fleet that Maslama had been counting on to save his campaign was beginning to dissolve before the battle even started. But the battle was still coming, and what came next in those spring waters outside Constantinople was not merely a naval engagement. It was a reckoning, chemistry, engineering, desperation, and genius, all colliding at once. Before we open up the secret behind that fire, however, we have something quick to take care of. Look, if there is one thing this story teaches you, it is that information is power. Leo III won this siege partly because he had better intelligence than Maslama, better spies, better understanding of the enemy's weaknesses, better awareness of what was happening on the water before his opponent could react. In the modern world, your personal information is your vulnerability, and protecting it matters just as much. That is why this video is sponsored by NordVPN. NordVPN encrypts your internet connection so that no one, not hackers, not your ISP, not sketchy public Wi-Fi, can see what you're doing online. I personally use it when I am traveling, researching, or just watching content that isn't available in my region, and it works seamlessly. You get military-grade encryption, a strict no-logs policy, and access to thousands of servers in over 60 countries, all with one click. Right now, if you use the link in the description, you can get an exclusive discount plus extra months free on NordVPN. The link is down below. Click it. Protect yourself. Leo III would have approved. Now, back to the water, back to the fire. Somewhere in the imperial arsenal of Constantinople, locked behind doors that only the emperor and a handful of trusted craftsmen could open, was a mixture that the Byzantines called by several names. They called it hygron pyr, liquid fire. They called it thalassan pyr, sea fire. Sometimes they simply called it prepared fire, as though the terrifying deliberateness of its creation was the most important thing about it. Modern historians would eventually call it Greek fire, and that name has stuck for 13 centuries, which is fitting, because 13 centuries later, we still don't know exactly what was in it. The story of how this weapon came to exist is itself remarkable. In the mid-7th century AD, a Greek-speaking architect and engineer named Callinicus of Heliopolis, from the city the Romans called Heliopolis, in what is now the Bekaa Valley of modern Lebanon, then considered part of Greater Syria, fled westward ahead of the Arab conquest of Syria, and arrived in Constantinople carrying what was either a revolutionary invention or a centuries-old alchemical tradition that he had finally refined into something weaponizable. The Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor records it plainly. Callinicus fled to the Romans and invented the sea fire, which set the boats of the Arabs alight and burned them completely. That first decisive combat use is usually placed during the first Arab siege of Constantinople, in the late 600s and 70s, often linked to the naval fighting around Cyzicus. The Arabs had not forgotten what that fire did to their fleet during that earlier siege. That is part of what makes the 717 campaign so psychologically fascinating. They came back anyway. They came back with a larger armada, more ships, more men, more determination. And yet the weapon was still there, still secret, still waiting. Now, here is the thing about the formula that drives historians and chemists slightly mad. We have fragments, educated guesses, partial reconstructions, but no complete recipe has ever survived. Modern scholars generally agree that the mixture was probably petroleum-based, with naphtha often treated as the most likely core ingredient, but the full composition and handling process remain unknown. Later writers and modern reconstructions have proposed additions such as resin, sulfur, pitch, or reactive minerals, but this is exactly the point. The weapon was not just a liquid. It was a guarded state system. Substance, storage, pressure, trained crews, and imperial secrecy all working together. That is the detail that turned Greek fire from a powerful weapon into a psychologically shattering one. You fight fire with water. Every human instinct, every piece of battlefield training tells you this. Greek fire took that instinct and made it useless. The delivery system itself was the other half of the genius, a bronze pump and siphon apparatus that used pressure to project the burning liquid in a directed stream. Its range was short by modern standards, but in the close quarters, naval combat of the ancient world, where ships grappled and boarded each other at arm's length, that was enough to turn an enemy vessel into a floating furnace before its crew could react. The bronze tube could be aimed from the prow. The stream was ignited as it left the nozzle. Modern experimental reconstructions suggest that the resulting heat could reach extreme temperatures, but the exact performance of the 8th century weapon remains an estimate, not a directly recorded ancient measurement. The ship that carried this weapon was the Droman, the Byzantine war galley that was the backbone of Constantinople's naval power throughout the Middle Byzantine period. The word droman comes from the Greek for runner, and speed was indeed the droman's defining characteristic. These were long, low, sleek vessels, typically oar-powered for combat maneuverability and rigged with sails for open sea transit. The largest dromans of the 8th century carried 2 banks of oars and could field a crew of roughly 100 to 200 men. The Greek fire siphon was mounted below the elevated forecastle at the prow, projecting forward and downward into an approaching enemy vessel, and in more sophisticated configurations, secondary siphons were carried amidships on either side, allowing the droman to spray fire in multiple directions simultaneously. These were not boats, they were weapons platforms, engineered specifically around the capabilities of the fire they carried. Personally, I think this is where the story becomes genuinely profound rather than just militarily fascinating. Consider what the Byzantines had built here. They had a secret so dangerous and so precious that Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the 10th century, warned his son in the most solemn possible terms that the formula for liquid fire had been revealed by an angel, and that any emperor who shared it with a foreign power was to be considered cursed before God. The knowledge was restricted to the imperial family and a small circle of artificers whose components were manufactured separately so that no single craftsman ever knew the complete recipe. The Romans who loaded those siphon tubes on the dromans in the Golden Horn in 717 AD were carrying something that their civilization had decided was literally heaven sent, something that existed specifically to protect them. And after a winter of watching the Arab army freeze and starve outside their walls, after months of uncertainty, rationing and prayer, they were about to find out whether that belief was justified. The Egyptian relief fleet had arrived in the Aegean in the spring of 718 AD. A second fleet followed from North Africa. Together, these reinforcement squadrons numbered somewhere in the range of 700 to 800 additional vessels, a colossal fresh wave of Arab naval power aimed at Constantinople's sea lanes. Their mission was to restore Maslama's position, resupply the land army, complete the sea blockade, and give the siege a renewed, fatal momentum. But something was already going wrong. The Egyptian ships, as noted by Theophanes, were crewed heavily by conscripted Christian sailors from the newly conquered territories of Egypt, men who had no love for the Umayyad banner, and who recognized, with professional sailors' instinct, that the narrow waters they were entering were not safe. Some deserted outright as the fleet entered the Bosphorus approaches. Others lingered, slowed, broke formation. Leo watched this from the walls and from his command vessels inside the Golden Horn. He had waited through the winter. He had negotiated with the Bulgars. He had held the city through prayer and rations and iron discipline, and now the enemy had come to him, come into the killing ground he had been preparing since September. The dromans were armed and crewed, the siphons were ready, the nozzle torches prepared. Leo gave the order in the spring of 718 AD, and the Golden Horn gates opened for the second time. What came out into the Bosphorus that morning was not a fleet in the conventional sense. It was a delivery mechanism for the most terrifying weapon in the known world. The dromans did not form a battle line and advance in the ordered ceremonial way of ancient naval warfare. They moved fast, low, and directly at the densest concentrations of Arab shipping. The Arab sailors who had heard the stories, and by now every sailor in the Umayyad fleet had heard the stories, recognized what was happening in the seconds before it happened. The bronze tubes, the pressurized hiss, and then the light. The first ships hit by the Greek fire in the spring engagement did not fight back. They burned. The fire spread from hull to hull, across the packed formation of Arab vessels, with a speed that left no room for organized response. The Egyptian conscripts who had already been wavering in their loyalty needed no further persuasion. The ones who could swim abandoned their ships wholesale. The ones who couldn't looked for any vessel that wasn't already on fire, and found fewer and fewer of them with every passing minute. The spring battle turned the Bosphorus approaches into a catastrophe for the Arab naval relief effort, and without resupply, Maslama's land army, already devastated by winter, disease and starvation, was now completely and irrevocably stranded. But the full apocalyptic finale was still to come, because Maslama had not yet given up, and Leo was not finished. The two forces were building toward a final collision in the harbour waters that would end not just this siege, but the entire question of whether the Arab world could take Constantinople by force. The stage was set, the fire was ready, and the sea was about to become something that no sailor in the history of the world had ever seen before. By late spring of 718 AD, the Arab position outside Constantinople had crossed a threshold from difficult to irretrievable. The land army, what remained of it after that savage winter, was a hollowed-out version of the force that had arrived with such terrifying confidence the previous summer. Its horses were gone, its camels were gone, its reserves of grain were gone. The plague that had moved through the siege lines during the cold months had carved out entire units, leaving gaps in formations that had once stretched from one sea to the other. Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, commanding this diminished host, was a general of real ability confronting a situation that no amount of ability could fully redeem. He had lost the winter, he had lost the naval initiative in September, and now the relief fleet, his last viable path to turning the siege around, had been gutted in the Bosphorus approaches by weapons his sailors still barely understood, and yet he didn't withdraw, not immediately. This is something worth sitting with for a moment, because the easy historical narrative casts the Arab retreat as inevitable from the moment the Greek fire first lit the water. In reality, Maslama held on. He sent urgent dispatches back to Damascus requesting additional forces. He tightened his siege lines, conserved what provisions remained, and waited to see whether the political situation inside Constantinople might crack before his own position completely collapsed. It was not irrational. Besieged cities had broken before from internal pressure. Food riots, palace coups, religious panic. Constantinople had its own history of political instability, and Maslama knew it. But Leo III was not the kind of emperor who broke. He had come from the frontier, and frontier men understand how to endure what others cannot. The Bulgars arrived from the north in the late spring or early summer of 718 AD. Khan Tervel had honoured the alliance that Leo had quietly secured during the winter months, and his cavalry, fast, brutal and deeply experienced in the open terrain of Thrace, struck the Arab rear with devastating efficiency. The Arab chronicles, which generally underreported the catastrophes of this campaign, were forced to acknowledge the scale of the destruction. Theophanes the Confessor records that the Bulgar assault killed somewhere in the region of 22,000 Arab soldiers in a single engagement. That figure may carry the usual ancient numerical exaggeration, but the core reality is undeniable. Maslama's army was now being attacked from behind while still failing to make any progress against the walls in front. The trap had fully closed. It was at this point that the second wave of Arab naval assets attempted to force the issue. The surviving ships from the Egyptian and African relief squadrons, repositioned and regrouped after the first devastating Byzantine sortie, made a second attempt to push through the Bosphorus and reach Maslama's position. There are elements of this engagement that the sources handle with slightly different emphasis. Theophanes focuses on the Greek fire, while later Arab chroniclers tend to gloss over the naval dimension entirely, but the broad operational picture is clear. Leo ordered his Droman fleet out again, and this time the engagement was not a swift surgical strike. It was a sustained battle across the full breadth of the harbour approaches, fought across a stretch of water that had no room for retreat and no room for error. You have to try to picture what this looked like from the walls of Constantinople. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary spectacles in the history of medieval warfare. The Byzantine dromons moving through packed Arab formations, siphons spraying continuously, turning entire sections of the fleet into interconnected pyres. The Arab ships were anchored and moored close together for mutual support, which in any other tactical situation would have been sound practice. But against Greek fire it was a death trap. Fire jumped between hulls, rigging caught, sails, soaked in pitch and salt, burned with a particular ferocity. Men jumped into the water to escape the flames on their ships, and found that the burning mixture had spread across the surface of the harbour itself, naphtha, lighter than water, floating and burning in slicks across the anchorage. There was no safe direction. The water burned, the ships burned. The sky above the harbour was a churning column of black smoke so dense and so high that Byzantine chronicles suggest it was visible from across the Bosphorus in Asia. Honestly, you have to ask yourself what was going through the minds of those men in the water. Not the commanders, not the strategists, the ordinary sailors. Men who had probably never seen Constantinople before this campaign, who had been told they were part of a divine mission, the fulfillment of prophecy, the final conquest of the Christian world's greatest city. And instead they were swimming in a harbour that was literally on fire, with nowhere to go in a foreign sea, watching their ships dissolve into ash around them. History doesn't record their individual names. It never does at this scale. But they were there, and what happened to them was as real and as terrible as anything recorded in the chronicles of the generals who survived to give their accounts. The destruction of the Arab fleet was not a single, clean, dramatic moment. It unfolded in stages. The initial Greek fire engagements, then the spreading of fire across moored vessels, then the chaotic, disorganized attempt by surviving ships to break out of the Bosphorus and retreat southward into the Aegean. That retreat became its own catastrophe. The currents of the Hellespont, always treacherous, were lethal to ships whose crews were exhausted, depleted and demoralized. Arab vessels ran aground on the Thracian and Anatolian shores. Others collided with each other in the desperate scramble to escape the burning harbour. The operational command structure of the fleet had dissolved entirely. Individual captains made individual decisions, and most of those decisions were wrong, because there was no good decision available to them. The Arab naval power assembled for this campaign, the product of years of shipbuilding, of felled cedar forests in Lebanon, of thousands of skilled sailors conscripted from across the Caliphate, ceased to exist as a fighting force in those spring and early summer waters. Then came the storms, as the battered remnant of the Arab armada limped southward through the Aegean, trying to make it back to the relative safety of Arab-controlled ports. The sea itself intervened. Theophanes records that a violent storm struck the fleet in the waters near the island of Thasos. A storm of the kind the Aegean generates with little warning in the late spring and early summer, when the thermal dynamics between the warming land and the still cold sea can produce weather of extraordinary violence. Ships that had survived the Greek fire engagements and the chaos of the retreat were driven onto rocky coastlines or swamped in open water. The storm was, for the survivors of the Arab fleet, a final crushing indignity, to have endured the fire, to have escaped the burning harbour, to have made it through the Hellespont, and then to be killed by the weather on the way home. The accumulated physical reality is staggering. The Arab fleet that had set out to end the Byzantine Empire was, by the summer of 718 AD, shattered as an operational force. The losses in ships were immense, though exact percentages depend heavily on which medieval figures you trust. The losses in men, sailors, soldiers, rowers, infantry, ran to catastrophic levels across the combined toll of winter starvation, plague, Bulgar attack, Greek fire and storm, even if the largest medieval numbers should be treated as rhetorical rather than statistical. On August 15th, 718 AD, the feast of the Dormition of the Virgin, a date the Byzantine chroniclers were absolutely not going to let pass without theological commentary, Maslam ibn Abd al-Malik gave the order to abandon the siege. His army, whatever remained of it, broke camp, demolished the siege works, and began the long, wretched march back eastward through Anatolia toward Arab-held territory. The march itself claimed more lives. Disease had never left the army, and the psychological devastation of defeat, after everything that had been sacrificed after the winter, after the fire, after the Bulgars, broke the cohesion of units that had stayed intact through sheer military discipline during the siege itself. Some soldiers simply vanished into the Anatolian countryside rather than complete a march that felt less like a retreat and more like a slow death. The Arab sources that survive from this period treat the Constantinople campaign with a studied brevity that speaks louder than pages of detailed lament. Where they do acknowledge the defeat, they frame it in the language of God's inscrutable will. The campaign failed because the time was not yet right, because the divine plan had not yet ordained the city's fall. This is, of course, exactly the same theological framing the Byzantines used for their victory, just pointed in the opposite direction. Both sides had convinced themselves that God was on their side. On August 15th, 718 AD, one side got the answer it needed. Leo III watched the Arab army leave from behind walls that had not been breached. His city had held. His fleet had destroyed an armada. His diplomacy had brought the Bulgars south at exactly the right moment. His logistical preparation had kept his people fed and his soldiers functional through a winter that had destroyed the enemy camped outside his gates. He had won through patience, intelligence, engineering, and a chemistry that his civilization was prepared to call miraculous. Walking those walls in the silence after the Arab camp was dismantled, watching the last dust of the retreating host fade into the Anatolian horizon, Leo III had just saved a civilization. He probably didn't feel triumphant. Men like Leo rarely do. They just start preparing for whatever comes next. The world that emerged from the siege of 717 to 718 AD was not a world of clean victories and celebrated survivors. Both empires paid a price that the histories of the winning side tend to underreport. The Byzantine Empire had held Constantinople, but the economic and demographic cost of a full year's siege had deepened wounds that were already severe. Leo's taxes and subsequent administrative reforms, including legal reforms and deeper reliance on the theme system, the empire's provincial military backbone, were not the actions of a confident empire consolidating strength. They were the desperate measures of a state trying to reconstitute itself after surviving something it should not have survived. The Umayyad Caliphate suffered a blow from which its expansionist momentum never fully recovered in the European theatre. The financial cost of building and losing 2 fleets, including the massive shipbuilding program specifically assembled for this campaign, drained resources that had previously funded the relentless westward and northward advance of Arab power. Caliph Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik died while the siege was still underway in 717 AD, never seeing the outcome of the campaign he had ordered. His successor, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, oversaw the retreat and its aftermath, and the political fallout within the caliphate was significant. Commanders were blamed, strategies were questioned. The near-mythical aura of Umayyad invincibility, built on decades of conquest from Spain to Persia, had cracked in the waters of the Bosphorus. And yet, the true scale of what was decided in those months between 717 and 718 AD only becomes clear when you zoom outward, when you look not at the empires themselves but at everything that existed behind them. Because Constantinople was not just a city, it was a barrier. It was the geographic and political cork in a bottle, blocking the direct overland route from the Arab-controlled Middle East into the Balkans, into Central Europe, into what would eventually become the civilizational heartland of the medieval Christian world. If Constantinople fell in 718 AD, there was no obvious equivalent fortified position between the Bosphorus and the Rhine capable of absorbing an Umayyad advance of the kind that had swept through Persia, Egypt and North Africa in a single generation. The Franks were still consolidating their power in Gaul. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were barely organised. The political patchwork of early medieval Europe had no Constantinople to put in front of an Arab army. History, of course, does not deal in certainties about roads not taken. Empires are not simple projectiles that travel in straight lines until stopped. The Arab advance might have slowed or stalled for any number of internal reasons, and indeed, it was eventually stopped at Tours in 732 AD by Charles Martel, a battle that many Western historians have traditionally celebrated as the decisive turning point. But Tours was fought in what is now central France, 14 years and more than 2,000 kilometres from Constantinople. The walls of the Theodosian fortifications and the bronze siphons of Leo's dromons had ensured that the question of Europe's fate was not answered at the Bosphorus. They pushed it west, bought the nascent kingdoms of Europe years to breathe and consolidate, and gave Charles Martel a battle he could actually win. What I find myself returning to, every time I read through the chronicles of this siege, is not the strategy or the chemistry, or even the brilliant cold competence of Leo III. It is that image of the ordinary men on both sides of those walls, the Arab soldiers eating their horses, the Byzantine citizens carrying icons along the ramparts in the middle of winter, the Egyptian conscripts jumping off their ships in the Bosphorus because they would rather drown than burn, the unnamed Byzantine artificers who had spent their entire working lives guarding a formula they couldn't fully explain except to say that an angel had given it to them. These are the people who actually decided the fate of Western civilization, not through grand gestures or divine favour, but through hunger and cold and desperate mundane survival. Survival has always been expensive. Constantinople survived, Europe survived, and the fire that made it possible burned on water, burned through wood, burned through the plans of an empire at the absolute peak of its power. And then, slowly, over the centuries that followed, the secret of how it was made burned itself out too, vanishing into history with the dynasty that had carried it. We remember the fire. We have lost the formula. Maybe that is fitting. Some weapons are too honest about what civilization is willing to do to keep itself alive. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely thank you. This is exactly the kind of deep, obsessive historical storytelling that this channel exists to make, and it only happens because of the people watching it. If this video did something for you, if it made you see this moment in history differently, if it gave you that feeling of genuine awe at what human beings are capable of both building and destroying, then hit subscribe, because we have a lot more coming. Every week on Wars in History, we go into the battles and the sieges and the moments that the textbooks give 2 paragraphs, and we give everything we have. If you want to go even deeper and directly support what we are building here, consider joining the channel as a member. Members get early access to scripts, behind-the-scenes research notes, and direct access to me and the members community. The link is right below this video, and it means more than I can properly express. For your next watch, the related video is right here, and I promise it hits just as hard as this one did. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next battle.